Hoy, 24 de mayo del 2019, tenemos el gusto de contar con Ingo Averdunk. Es un ingeniero distinguido, líder de arquitectura y soluciones de gestión de servicios y continuidad de negocios en la nube de IBM. Él es responsable por desarrollar iniciativas de transformación para clientes estratégicos a nivel internacional y además es coautor de uno de los principales libros donde se refleja el framework desarrollado para IBM para el Cloud Adoption. Él es un ciudadano alemán y la charla del día de hoy va a ser conducida en idioma inglés. Gracias por su participación, esperamos les guste el tema.
Hello, my name is Ingo Averdunk and I welcome you to the Meet&Learn event. We wrote this book, the Cloud Adoption Playbook, to describe best practice patterns on how customers adopt the cloud. And I give you a quick update on what we do in this book, what the experiences is, and some customer stories around it.
And we see the supporting presentation as well. When we say cloud adoption or digital transformation, it's certainly on top of many people, right? CIOs, CTOs, architects, and so on. They see the benefits of moving to the cloud, things like time to market, maybe cost reduction, but at the same time they struggle how to start, where to start, is it viable, and so on. And this is really what led us to writing this book, because I think we have a really good practice on how we run this more like an engine, the transformation with clients. We have a proven methodology, and this book is basically documenting this methodology. So what you see here is actually an element that we've done with a client, where we said, okay, let's assume we are successful in this transformation. Let's assume we are successful in moving to the cloud. And we are so successful that a CIO magazine, a Forbes, would do an article on us. Right? What would that article look like? What would be the chapters that people would like to read about, right? And that's what we said. So let's portray ourselves in 5 years, and here's the magazine that features this project, right? What are the chapters that you want to talk? And this was a really nice marketing instrument, because we use that as a way to communicating the strategic intent, communicating the elements which are relevant. And we distributed this magazine, so we printed this magazine in high quality, and we distributed to all the stakeholders in the various countries, in the various subsidiaries of this company, so that everybody really have a clear and crisp understanding what this is all about, right? And it gives us this North Star for the project team to march against, right? So we always do small steps, but we don't lose sight of the ultimate goal, what we want to do, and that's expressed in this magazine. And I thought this was a really nice idea to really rally everybody behind the same goal. So let's talk about how we did it. And digital transformation, I think this is one of those terms that are used quite a bit, right? It's the change associated to applying technology, digital technology, through everything we do, whether it's in the business side, whether it's in the customer journeys, pretty much all the way to society. Right? And then cloud adoption, that's a way how you would implement this digital transformation. Right? And why do you want to do this? What are the outcomes? And certainly, especially in the cloud, it all started with lowering the cost, right? And customers saw the value of not running the hardware themselves, not doing the maintenance of those activities in the infrastructure, delegating that to a cloud provider. But now I think the market also matured, and in addition to the cost, there are other aspects to it. For example, faster time to market, that you could respond to an opportunity or to a threat at speed, right? Taking advantage of those new innovations that's happening, right? Look at things like Kubernetes and containers. Like a year ago, only a few talked about it, and now everybody's talking about it. Everybody aggressively adopting those things, right? Another element is quality, right? By doing small iterations, learning from it, and then pivoting if something is not working or something is not working right, allows you to overall achieve much higher quality on it. And you want to do it at scale, right? You don't want to do it just for a small application. You want to really pivot the entire business towards this digital journey. And that means once you have a pattern that works within the account, within the skill that you have, you want to repeat it. Once you have a reference architecture, you want to apply the reference architecture to other applications as well, right? And then certainly security and compliance is also quite important these days, not only because GDPR, but you see on a regular basis breaches and security concerns by customers, right? So security, safety, privacy, compliance are also quite a big factor towards this move, right? You cannot catch up with the amount of changes and security requirements that are coming. So those are all market forces and outcomes that you expect from transformation and you expect from a cloud transformation. So let's talk a little bit how we did it, right? And here are quite a few examples. We have done literally thousands of engagements of customers moving to the cloud. And like I said, we built a muscle and we built a good methodology how to do that at scale. Just to highlight a few customers like American Airlines. It's a customer that we have been dealing with over the last 3 years or so. It started the journey by the need of hardware replacement. And at that time, there was certainly a discussion about like, well, should I replace hardware or maybe move the workload into the cloud and get rid of this capital expense. And that's what we did at the first step, right? Do a lift and shift, take the workload of a monolithic application and move that into the cloud. But that was just an intermediate step. What we really wanted to do is taking advantage of the cloud and then slowly refactoring this monolith into more decomposable and reusable components so that a new function doesn't have to develop multiple times, right? This customer has different channels, right? A channel would be a web application, a mobile application, or a self-service terminal. And when you get a new function, you don't want to implement it 3 times. They said, okay, can we implement it once in a reusable microservice, and then those different channels could benefit from it. And
I saw a video which they had I believe in US or Canada, and the customer was going through a pilot of how to make new arrangements to change your flights, and they decided over the counter to move this proof of concept to production because of the urgency they have, and it was really successful for them, right? So it was like American Airlines showing this was successful.
Yeah, and Alexander, that was actually the second play on this. So the first play was basically modernizing an existing application. And what you are referring to is the other stream that we did at American Airlines, which is innovating new functions, so building new functions. What you're referring to is called dynamic reacom at American Airlines. Just imagine you're a passenger, right, and you're at a flight delay, and then you're either in a service center queue, waiting for an agent to pick up the phone, and that you're already a frustrated customer, and then if you have to wait in the queue for another 20 minutes, you could imagine that the customer is quite frustrated. Or you are at the airport being in a long queue on the gate waiting for rebooking. So the idea was, so can we write a new function that provides this capability in a self-service model, right? So that you don't have to talk to a service agent, don't stay in a queue, but rather at the fingertip, the application shows you here are different flights and allows you to then select the one which is best for you. And that gives a lot of value, right? Customer is no longer frustrated. He's on his own hands and he selects the best choice for him, right? Every customer probably have a different preference. And the cloud allowed them to do this innovation in a very rapid fashion, right? They said it's probably taking only 50% of the time that used to take to build this function. They could do it now with those modern practices, cloud, DevOps, continued improvement, continued deployment. All those are elements that enabled American Airlines to build this function rapidly. So that was one case, American Airlines. You see also other cases like BNP Paribas in Europe, where we do a hybrid cloud architecture where part of it is in the public cloud, in a multi-zone region environment, and the some part because of requirements of security, of privacy, of governance had to live in their local data center, right? So the notion of a hybrid application. Part is on private cloud, public is in a public cloud, integrated to each other. That's where we work together with BNP Paribas. And there are other customers like Itaú, where the customer was already doing a lot of journey towards DevOps, right? They modernized the way that they develop code using squads and guilds and those kind of things. But operations was left very much in the old way. And at Itaú, we had a fairly large engagement where we looked into how can we modernize operations so that operations would actually enable and support the velocity coming from development and enable it in high quality. So we tossed the word of velocity with quality as a mantra that we did at Itaú. And me personally, I'm engaged at Cemex in Mexico. You also see here. Cemex is, from my perspective, also quite interesting. They are a customer that uses a lot of SAP in the back end. And they completely innovated the environment where they said, okay, what are the customer touch points like ordering, invoicing, tracking, and can we provide those capabilities not through a service agent, but rather through digitalization, right? So mobile application, web application, where a plant manager could order a load of trucks of cement directly on the mobile, right? And they could track where the trucks are so that the plant is getting prepared whenever the trucks arrive, that they could immediately take the load and produce it and consume it. So a lot of new functions, new capabilities, much closer to the end user. So those are just a few examples, and we literally had thousands of engagements of customers in different flavors doing the journey to cloud. And while we're on those customers, the one thing that we learned quite clearly is that when you move to the cloud, it's not just technology. There are a lot of aspects that need to be considered when you move to the cloud, right? Things like organization, right? So rather than having a siloed organization where you have maybe a design organization and a build organization, a test organization, and an operations organization, you start bringing those together, right? Having a full life cycle support by a single squad, for example. And yet there's the line of business who is completely aside again, right? You need to have the product owners, the line of business participating in those journeys. And one element that our customers are quite interested in is also the skill, right? You have existing skill, existing talent, and that is okay for the traditional workload, but now we're talking about much different things, right? We talk about different programming frameworks. We talk about different programming languages, different components, software as a service model, consumption, and so on. And you cannot start fresh on this, right? You need to somehow enable and up-level the skill that you have, right? So that's a big concern for many of the enterprises. How do I cope with the existing talent, and how can I enable, teach, and educate the existing people to follow that journey, right? And it's not just the doers, it's also the leaders, right? So what are the leadership characteristics? What are the requirements for the technical leaders to support this journey, right? Good example, and we're moving a little bit to the cultural element, is how do I cope with failure, right? Will I punish people if they do a mistake? Or do I treat that as a learning entity that I learn from it and make sure that the system will not allow me to do the same mistake all over, right? So rather than punishing and look at human as a scapegoat, learning from it and make sure that the entire organization learns from it, right? So organization, skill, leadership is an element. Governance, another element, right? But also the method. What is the methodology, right? What used to be very much like waterfall driven, you know exactly what will be done the next 12 months. That's no longer working in this environment, right? There are so many technology changes to it. So you need to have a proven method that allows you to iterate, learn from it, measure it, and then start reiterating on it. So those are various aspects to it, right? Because there are a lot of questions, right? And these are not just technology questions, right? Where do I start, right? What tools should I be using? Where do I need to provide governance on the tools? And where do I provide a little bit more flexibility, that the squads are more autonomous? Where are we improvising, right? How do I handle incidents in an efficient way? Those are questions that customers have, and we try to address them in this playbook. Right? And this really leads to what we call cloud adoption and transformation. That's a practice, that's a framework around it. And it really has two elements. One is a phased approach, which we call think, transform, thrive. Many customers tell us that the move from ignition from an idea to executing the strategy to then to scale and to thrive this in the company, that's a challenge. So we use think, transform, and thrive as an easy way to express those three steps of that journey. And then at the bottom, you see our framework. And like I mentioned, there are like multiple dimensions in addition to technology. Our framework has 7 different dimensions, and we go to this in a moment. And we want to look holistically at all the aspects which you need to consider when moving to the cloud. Right. So let's talk about the framework while we're on it. Right. And certainly architecture and technology is quite important. Right. We still need to discuss: am I using infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, container as a service, all the way to software as a service, or maybe functions as a service, right? I still need to discuss, do I do public cloud or private cloud? Or what we more and more favor is the notion of hybrid cloud. Dual vendor strategy, what expressed to multi-cloud. Those are still valid discussions that need to be taken place. But like I explained earlier, there are other elements to it, like the culture and organizational elements we just discussed about, right? Like security and compliance, right? What data should live where? How do I protect? How do I mitigate at speed? How do I even detect at speed? And how do I adhere to regulational requirements? Then operations is typically an afterthought. And like we've seen in customers, sometimes operations is slowing down the velocity. So you could do a lot at the beginning, but then you hit this glass wall about operations not being able to pick up that speed, right? That's where in our framework, operations, so service management and operations is quite important to not only support, but also to learn from it, right? If I be smart and see how customers use my application in production, I could feed that back to my beginning, to the line of business and say, okay, what functions resonate well with my customer base? Where do I see uptake? Where do I move the needle from a business perspective because this function really attracts the market, attracts my user, right? So don't see it as a dead end, but rather as an element that I could learn in production from real users and feed that back to the next iteration, to the next cycle, right? And then data and governance is, I think, quite important these days. Where should data live in a scalable fashion, and concerned about like data provenance, regulation needs, and so on. In the middle, you see 2 quite important topics as well. One is emerging innovation spaces, and that's a little bit of a mouthful, this term, but it's all around things that happen right now in the industry, right? In the conference we just went to, we had quite a few discussions, right? There was a presentation about blockchain and how blockchain technology could be used and leveraged. There was a presentation about artificial intelligence, right? We certainly love Watson, but there are other AI technologies that also, I think, more and more customers need to be looking at. Internet of Things, another element to it. And then there's a next wave coming up with maybe quantum computing and others, right? So there are a lot of things happening, and this framework need to make sure that we are not just providing for the things that we know today, but rather be prepared for new technology as it arises, evaluate it, and maybe test and see if it helps to move the business forward. Right? It is all centered around a methodology, a proven methodology, where we look holistically on it, but still be actionable. Right? So do it in small pieces. The notion of what we call MVPs, minimum viable products, or minimum viable process, where we identify the minimum thing that we could do in order to experiment, learn from it, and then start reiterating and make it bigger, 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 until you eventually get to the full solution. Right? But use that as an element to test, use it as an element to learn, and to probe things. Right? An agile practice, not only for software development, but also for delivery, for operations, for the way how business and technology is aligned. And that really gives the 7 dimensions of our framework that we call cloud adoption and transformation. Right? Those 7 elements are not in isolation, right? They are kind of linked together. For example, and I mentioned this already, right? Operations providing feedback to the product owner, to the developer to see what resonates, like doing A/B testing, for example. Or when I talk about this innovation space, how can I quickly test something out, right? Do I need to install an operating system and a database and then patching and so on? Or is it provided as a platform, as a service where I basically just instantiate and play around with it? So how much effort is it to start doing my hello world on the new things, right? And this is where technology comes into play, right? The technology needs to enable me to do those innovations at speed, right? Yeah, other element would be tool chains, right? Do I have the right tooling in place? Do I have things like continued deployment, continued integration? How do I link security with it, right? Do you have a Kanban board where all the backlog items are tracked and prioritized? Backlog items from the line of business, backlog items from the developer, and backlog items from operations. So you see that all those elements are really stitching together and kind of depending on each other. And we don't want to do the same mistake that we are thinking in silos, right? They really need to be integrated to it. Right. So let's talk about some adoption examples. And you certainly could appreciate that not every customer is the same, right? There are customers who are more radical and disruptive because of the business they are in or because of competition they are facing. And then there are customers who are more evolutionary or incremental, right? Again, maybe because of the business, right? If I'm in insurance, by definition, I cannot be too radical, right? Because that's not the business that I'm in, right? I'd rather do radical, evolutionary, incremental changes on it, right? And those could be different aspects, right? The speed of change, the ability to change the organization, the cost of failure, right? Cost of failure for a financial institution, investment banking might be much higher than, let's say, in a retail environment, right? What is my technology approach? How do I select technology? So different ways, and it's almost like what we here portrays, almost like dials, where you basically move the dial depending on where you are in this journey, where your company and your business sits in. I have two examples, one the global airline and one a large bank, and let me just talk a little bit about those two. The global airline, we already talked quite a few examples on it, right? Moving a monolith application and break that into more decomposed application, high degree of reuse, and then benefiting it not only for the existing applications, but also allowing net new applications. And the value is significant, right? When you see here that new customer-facing applications was delivered in less than half of the time than before, right? That's a statement for time to market. That's a statement of be able to respond to opportunities, respond to threats. And in this market, this is quite important, right? Because you see that the airline industry is characterized with a lot of competition, and it's not the equipment that makes a difference, right? It's the experience that the user has from leaving their house all the way at arriving at the destination. And this is, I think, a good example of what we did here. The other example is more a one that characterized with incremental changes. It's a large bank out of Europe, but it's a global bank, and we had a cloud evaluation consultancy with them where we said, okay, let's build up the roadmap over the next years, right? So we did an evaluation. We looked at the aspects, the dimensions of that framework, assessed the environment, analyzed the environment, and then built up a roadmap, communicated this roadmap, and then basically provided a path forward. We also created a cloud center of competency where I said, okay, now there need to be some governance element to it, right? That basically acts as a sounding board for new ideas, making sure that once we have experience, we could share the experience, we could build reference architectures, we could share proven practices, and really act as a governance, a control entity to support and to control in a positive way the move towards cloud. So you see here two examples, one a little bit more aggressive, one a little bit more conservative. But the nice thing on this method is that the method allows us to support both flavors of customers with the same approach, with the same elements. Right. A key element is a method, the IBM Garage method for the cloud. where we look holistically at the entire life cycle of an idea. So from inception of the idea towards thinking about how it would be expressed in architectures, doing the coding, doing the production in introduction, and then learn from it, and then basically cycle through that, right? So there are principles like break down the program into consumable pieces, right? Break down the silos, engage the entire organization, not just individual, a small DevOps team. No, you want to have the entire organization participate here. It looks holistic, but then pragmatic. We do 2-week sprints where we said, okay, we are not boiling the ocean. We identify the MVP and then do that for 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks at most, and then cycle through it. Okay. Different elements to it. If you see here the link on the Garage Method website, we document a lot of the practices like pair programming, where you have 2 people working on the code at the same time, right? Because we feel that this gives a much higher degree of quality in the product. You get documentation immediately on it, and you make sure that the skill is inseminated into the organization. So we are a strong believer of pair programming as a way to instill the new sense of coding and the new approach into the organization. And we do that, quite frankly, at the beginning, where you have an IBM and the customer sitting next to each other, right? Almost lab to lab, right? The IBMer teaches the customer, and then on the next cycle, maybe the customer takes over, right? And then that's our proven way to scale, where we teach the customer to swim, and then basically it's a train the trainer approach, where then maybe the customer in the next iteration becomes a trainer for the next wave of people. Okay, that's just one example, right? Test-driven development, another one, and an end. Here's an example of this garage, right? And you see it's a completely different environment, right? The environment is not just what used to be like a coding environment or the traditional IBM environment. No, we have so-called garage locations where we want to instill the appetite to innovate, right? We do a lot of post-its where we come up with new ideas. But before we do this, we want to learn about the user that is benefiting from that service, right? So it's a very much user-centric design. And that's what we do, right? At the beginning, we do empathy maps where we describe what the user is all about. What does it do? What does it think? What does it say? So really get an emotional awareness of my end user. Even before we have touched the keyboard, before we've written any code, we first need to understand what is the user, right? And then we do a journey map, the day in the life of the journey, right? Day in the life of a certain task that the user needs to accomplish. We identify what are the steps, what are the challenges, identifying through ideation ideas how to circumvent those challenges, and then boil down to an MVP, to a minimum viable product. Right? And then we start doing the coding, right? So the first couple of days are completely keyboard-less, right? Very interactive. And you see here also, it's a very multidisciplinary team, right? Ideally, we want to have the line of business participating with the developer and the architect and the security guy and the ops guy. They all should collaborate at the beginning, right? Because we feel by having a multidisciplinary team participating early on, we could spot ideas and we could spot mistakes before even writing the code, right? If the ops guy would participate and said, well, have you thought about high availability, or have you thought about security, right? Those are elements that need to be touched much earlier, because the longer it takes for you to realize this mistake, the more expensive it is, right? That's where we want to have multidisciplinary teams, right? We have the garage location. So in Latin America, we have today Sao Paulo. We have, I think, Buenos Aires is the next garage we are going to establish. But we also provide like pop-up garages where we go to a client and do this notion and the concept of a garage with a client. I mentioned American Airlines before. Certainly a garage doesn't work in the context of an airline. So for American Airlines, we created a hangar. Right, so we what used to be a garage, we now call hangar at American Airlines, but the same concept, right? An agile space where people could play around, incept ideas, ideate around it, and then learn those new methodologies. Okay, now the next element is, so if I have proven patterns. If I have the notion of reference architectures, how could I make sure that it scales, that other teams would benefit from it? You see here a snapshot, a screenshot of the IBM Architecture Center, which is our place where we document reference architectures, we provide code to download and to play around with. We document practices like the one I was explaining before, like test-driven development or pair programming and so on. So we document this all in a one-place stop. And this is also like where our classes are, where education and training happens. So really one place where all the information is being disseminated. And what we've done recently is we're taking this snapshot and applied it to customers where I said, okay, I like the idea of reference architectures, but maybe my reference architecture is a little bit different, or we have additional reference architectures. We have maybe a variation of patterns. Maybe we want to provide different code bases because we are using different programming languages. So we take basically this architecture center, white label it, and provide it with customers so that they could benefit from the thought leadership from IBM, but then do fine tuning and adoption and additions for the specific customer at hand. So quite successful as a way how the thrive element, the scale element in this journey could be supported in the notion of like an architecture center. Right. So why does this framework work? There are a few elements which I think I want to call out. Right. It considers the big picture, right? The 7 dimensions of the cloud adoption framework. It involves the right people. And it aligns business and technology together, right? It takes a holistic approach, yes, but it's still actionable, right? The notion of minimal viable products, iteration, learn from it, fail fast, all those ingredients are important, not losing sight of the big picture, right? So it's a combination of both worlds, which I think is quite important here. The second element I want to call out is it already addresses a lot of the concerns the customers have, right? How do I upgrade my culture? Will my tools work in this cloud journey? Do I need to uplift my tools, right? Do I need to change the way how we do decisions, right? All those elements which are quite important for our customers, we try to address in this framework, in this methodology. And yes, we take those new practice approach. We take things like agile, lean, right? We want to establish a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching it, right? The notion of the garages, which I think is important, right? You need to have that freedom to test, the freedom to play out, to play around with it, and then learn from it. Unless you break it, and that's why we deliberately use the garage location as a way to break the traditional working environment, unless you portray that freedom, people might fall back into old habits, right? So those are 3 elements why this framework works, and we have small customers, large customers globally, so this is not just in the mature markets. No, by all means, we can apply to first, second, and third class countries. So just in summary, what are the key takeaways, right? So customers do cloud today. They transform today, and this model is a holistic way to support customers, whether they're beginning the journey or they're in the middle of the journey. This framework helps them, right? It's a holistic approach, but still pragmatic approach through iteration, through small entity-like thinking. So think big, but act small is the mission here, right? And then certainly the different form factors, whether it's the notion of hybrid cloud, right? Patterns for open, patterns for security, patterns for giving customers choices. I think those are quite important and certainly supported by this approach. If you want to learn more about it, please go to those links, right? Whether it's the adoption framework that we have on our Garage Method website, whether it's the adoption playbook, where all the elements, 7 elements that I talked about in the framework, are described in glory detail. It's more almost like a brain dump of our experience expressed in this book. Chapter by chapter, we discuss all the aspects and dimensions of the framework. Please, by all means, take a look at the book, and you could for sure benefit a lot of those customer cases that we have documented.